The year was 1687. The edge of the New England frontier was a place where the world itself seemed unfinished. Towering forests loomed like black walls against the pale horizon. Rivers cut through the land like veins of silver, their waters often running colder than bone. Beyond the safety of clustered villages, danger prowled, wolves in the thickets, whispers of native unrest, and an ever-present sense that the wilderness itself was alive, watching, waiting. It was into this uncertain world that Prudence Fairweather was born. Her father was a farmer, the kind of man who carried scripture in his voice and discipline in his hands. He believed the world was a trial by fire, and that only the righteous would endure its flames. Her mother was quieter, her presence more shadow than substance, moving about the household with eyes that seemed always cast downward. Neighbors often remarked that the Fairweather home felt unnaturally silent, even in moments of prayer, as though sound itself hesitated to dwell within those walls. Prudence entered life with that same silence, yet from the beginning, she was unlike the other children. Where they laughed, she stared. Where they wept, she smiled. Her small hands lingered too long on suffering animals, an injured bird, a snared rabbit, a dying lamb. While others recoiled in pity, Prudence watched with a gaze that was not cruel but disturbingly curious, as though she sought to glimpse something beyond life, hidden in the last gasps of pain. By the time she was 7, whispers had begun to coil through the village like smoke. The preacher's wife swore she had seen Prudence speaking to herself by the river, though no one stood near her. A black cat followed her home from the woods and refused to leave her side, a creature many regarded as a dark omen. The children of the settlement avoided her, claiming her eyes were too still, too cold, as though they belonged not to a child but to something older, something that had lived through centuries of silent winters. And yet, Prudence thrived. While others stumbled through their lessons, she read with ease. She could recite scripture word for word, though the tone of her voice unsettled even the minister. It was not reverent but calm, almost hollow, as if she were less praising God than echoing him. Her father took pride in her discipline, unaware that beneath her obedience simmered something darker. The true beginning of shadows came in the winter of her 13th year. It was a season of endless storms. Snow buried the fields, ice shattered the trees, and famine gripped the settlement. Livestock perished, and hunger crept into every home. It was then that Prudence revealed her uncanny calm. While others wept with hunger, she did not complain. She ate less than anyone, yet seemed to grow stronger, her cheeks never hollow, her body never frail. Neighbors whispered that she was sustained not by food, but by something else. The turning point came one frozen morning when a child from the village vanished. Tracks in the snow led to the woods, but ended abruptly, as if the earth itself had swallowed him. Search parties scoured the forest, but returned empty-handed. Rumors grew restless, and eyes began to settle on Prudence. She had been seen wandering the treeline the evening before, her dress pale against the snow, her lips whispering words the wind seemed eager to carry away. Her father defended her, his voice thundering from the pulpit, insisting his daughter was pure. But her mother said nothing. She simply stared into the fire that night, as though the flames carried truths too heavy to speak aloud. Prudence, for her part, only smiled when asked about the missing child, a smile that did not reach her eyes. As the years passed, disappearances began to haunt the settlement with eerie regularity. A trapper one season, a widowed woman the next. Each loss was explained away: wolves, native raids, the dangers of the frontier. Yet always, somehow, Prudence had been near. She was seen where others vanished. She spoke of death with an ease that unsettled even the bravest men.by her 18th year. The name Prudence Fairweather had become a whispered curse, her presence a shadow upon the settlement. She did not confess, she did not deny, but her very silence became an answer of its own. The frontier was a crucible, a place where faith and fear clashed in the raw wilderness. And in the figure of Prudence Fairweather, the villagers saw the embodiment of their deepest dread, that evil was not only lurking beyond the tree-line, but could be born within their very walls, nurtured in silence, and raised beneath the watchful eye of God himself. Season 1 closes on this revelation, not with proof, but with terror. For the people of New England, it no longer mattered whether Prudence was guilty or innocent. What mattered was the shadow she cast, a shadow that would stretch far beyond her lifetime, staining the soil of colonial America with the birth of a legend, a whisper, and perhaps the first serial killer of the New World. The frontier was never a gentle place. In the raw, unsettled corners of colonial America, survival was a daily bargain with nature, bitter winters, prowling wolves, and the constant threat of hunger pressed down on every household. In such a world, childhood itself was different, short, harsh, and shadowed by the ever-present reality of death. For many children, play was a fleeting escape. Simple cloth dolls, carved wooden animals, or corn-husk toys that offered a momentary taste of innocence. But for Prudence Fairweather, innocence was something she never seemed to possess. From the very beginning, her games unsettled those around her. While other children dressed their dolls and staged make-believe dances, Prudence staged funerals. She would dig small graves behind her family's cabin, lowering her corn-husk dolls into the earth, whispering prayers in a strange, almost melodic tone that made the hair on the back of the neck rise. Sometimes she would mark the earth with crooked crosses made from twigs, her childish handwriting scratching names onto bark as if she were already keeping a ledger of the dead. Parents began to notice. Mothers gathering at the well whispered of the Fairweather girls. Unnatural play. Fathers, hardened men used to blood and toil, admitted unease when they found her crouched in the fields, humming as she buried the tiny bodies of insects she had killed with deliberate care. And then there were the forests. Prudence was drawn to them like a moth to flame. The wilderness of the frontier was vast, stretching endless and untamed beyond the edges of the settlement. To most children, the woods were a place of fear, the lurking danger of wild beasts, the whispers of unseen eyes, and the old stories of spirits told in hushed tones beside the hearth. But to Prudence, the forest seemed to welcome her. She would vanish for hours, wandering deeper than any child dared, and return with mud-stained skirts and hands streaked in red. When questioned, she would smile and say she had been helping God test his creatures. No one understood what she meant. Rumors spread quickly in a settlement so small, where every family depended on the other. Parents began to forbid their children from following her, warning them that Prudence was strange, touched perhaps by something not of God. But curiosity is a powerful force. And children, even in the harshest of times, are drawn to mysteries they cannot explain. One by one, they followed her into the woods. And one by one, they came back changed. Those who went with Prudence refused to speak of what they saw. They returned pale, wide-eyed, trembling as if they had glimpsed something that should never be spoken aloud. Some refused to sleep alone at night, clinging to their mothers, whimpering at shadows. Others grew quiet and distant, staring off into the firelight with a haunted look. It was as if Prudence had taken something from them in those hours lost among the trees. The frontier had always been a place of struggle, where families contended with hunger, loss, and the specter of disease. But now, in hushed conversations, the settlers whispered of something darker. Wolves, storms, and hunger were dangers they could understand. Prudence Fairweather was something they could not, and so a seed of dread was planted. A child, no older than 8, who spoke of graves and blood and God's cruel tests. A girl who seemed more at home in the silence of the forest than in the laughter of children. The other parents began to say it plainly, though only in whispers. There was something wrong with the Fairweather child. The frontier of colonial America was a place of endless hardship. Settlers carved their homes out of dense wilderness, their days ruled by hunger, cold, and the ever-present threat of disease. Every sunrise was a battle for survival, and every nightfall brought with it the creeping dread of dangers lurking just beyond the firelight. Wolves prowled the forests, famine stalked the fields, and raids from hostile tribes were a constant fear. Yet, in one small frontier village, another, far more sinister terror took root, one not from outside the settlement, but born within. It began with the livestock. Farmers woke to find their animals lying dead in the frost, their throats torn open, their bodies curiously arranged as if by some unseen hand. Sheep were discovered with every drop of blood drained, chickens left in strange spirals upon the ground. At first, the settlers blamed wolves, their tracks often found nearby. But the killings grew stranger, more deliberate, more unexplainable. Soon, the horror spread from the barns to the homes. Children began to vanish in the dead of night. Doors left barred at dusk were found open by dawn. Mothers wept as their sons and daughters disappeared without a sound, leaving only a faint trail of blood in the snow or the smell of iron lingering in the air. The villagers whispered of witchcraft, of demons, of a darkness that had settled over their small outpost of civilization, and always one name lingered at the edge of every fearful conversation: Prudence Fairweather. Prudence was not like the other women of the settlement. Her pale, sharp features and haunting silence unsettled her neighbors. She was often seen wandering the woods alone, her black cloak sweeping against the snow. Her absences always seemed to coincide with the nights of horror. She offered no explanations, and when questioned, her eyes gave answers that words never could. Fear grew like wildfire. At first, no one dared accuse her outright. The memory of Salem and its burning still weighed heavy in their minds. But suspicion is a disease, and soon the infection spread. Mothers pulled their children close when Prudence passed. Men spat the word, which under their breath. Yet none dared confront her, for deep inside they feared she was far worse than any witch. The mutilations continued. The missing children were never found. And by the third winter, the villagers were no longer whispering, they were praying. Prudence had become more than a woman in their eyes. She was a shadow, a curse, a specter in human form. And the settlers lived each day with a new, gnawing dread, not of wolves or famine or raids, but of the quiet woman whose name had become the very definition of fear. This was life on the frontier, a world where nature was merciless, where men and women clung to life by the thinnest of threads, and where sometimes the greatest horror of all came not from the wilderness, but from within their own walls. This is the story of Prudence Fairweather, the frontier's most whispered name. A name that turned neighbors into cowards, and fear into legend. The year was 1698. The colonies were young, raw, and restless. The frontier was a place of hunger and ambition, where families clawed survival out of the wilderness, and whispers of the supernatural walked side by side with faith in God. The towns were small, the farms scattered, and every shadow carried the weight of fear. fear of starvation, of raids, of the unknown that lingered just beyond the tree line. It was into this uneasy world that Prudence Fairweather carved her dark path. Until now, she had been regarded as an oddity, a woman who lived alone, with sharp eyes and sharper words. Some pitied her, others avoided her, but all agreed she had a strange presence about her, as if she walked with secrets no one dared to ask. The first true horror struck in the late spring of that year. A young farmhand, no older than 19, vanished after paying a visit to the Fairweather homestead. His family believed he had been courting Prudence's maid, yet when he did not return, a search party was raised. Days later, the boy's body was found floating in the river, his throat cut with surgical precision. The wound was unlike anything the villagers had seen, too clean, too deliberate. Whispers began immediately, hushed but heavy. Some spoke of Prudence's skill with knives, others recalled the way she had watched the boy at market, her expression unreadable. Still, there was no proof, and in the colonies, proof meant survival. The death was marked down to misfortune. But fate was not done. That summer, a traveling peddler disappeared after boasting of the fine wares he carried. He was last seen bargaining with Prudence near the edge of town. Weeks later, his pack horse wandered back alone, its saddlebags empty, its hide slashed as if by cruel hands. The peddler's body was never recovered, and though many suspected Prudence, none dared confront her openly. Fear had taken root. Then came autumn, when the preacher's daughter vanished on her way home from evening prayers. She had been a bright and pious child, her absence throwing the congregation into chaos. The church bells tolled as the town searched the woods and streams, calling her name until their voices cracked. Prudence attended every gathering, her face calm, her eyes cool, as if she were observing the grief rather than sharing it. Winter followed with its long nights and bitter winds, and with it came the most chilling disappearance of all, a mother and her infant, gone without a trace as they walked to Sunday service. Their footprints were found in the snow, leading toward the woods near Prudence's land, but there were no tracks leading back. The silence that followed was more damning than any accusation. By now, the funerals were multiplying, and always, Prudence was near. The town was divided. Some insisted she was cursed, a witch born of the devil's brood. Others whispered she was only a woman, strange, yes, but not guilty. Yet even those who defended her could not ignore the dark coincidence that surrounded her every step. Fear spread like wildfire. Farmers began to keep their children indoors. Women crossed themselves when Prudence passed in the street, and men watched her from behind their shutters as though she were a wolf circling their homes. These killings, or vanishings, as some preferred to call them, were only the beginning. In the fragile world of colonial America, where law was thin and justice thinner, Prudence Fairweather had discovered something no one else dared to name: the taste of blood. And once it touched her lips, there was no turning back. The year 1698 would be remembered not only as a year of hunger and hardship on the frontier, but as the year the quiet figure of Prudence Fairweather became something else entirely. No longer an outcast. No longer merely a widow with strange habits. She had become a shadow in the wilderness, a terror that lived among them, patient and precise. The first killings had begun, and the colony would never be the same again. The year was 1697. Colonial America was still trembling in the aftermath of the Salem witch trials. The gallows of Massachusetts had fallen silent, but their shadows stretched far beyond the village green. Fear clung to the colonies like a sickness, and in every settlement, whispers of witchcraft simmered beneath the surface. It was in this atmosphere of suspicion that the name Prudence Fairweather once again returned to the forefront of fear. Unlike the women who had perished in Salem, housewives, servants, and healers, Prudence was something else entirely. She was neither meek nor broken. Her presence was commanding, her voice sharp as the edge of a blade, and her eyes, so the townsfolk swore, could pierce straight through a man's soul. When the accusations came, as they always did, she was dragged before the magistrates. The courtroom air was thick with dread, the wooden benches filled with villagers clutching their Bibles tight. Accusers trembled, swearing they had seen Prudence walking by moonlight, speaking to shadows that had no form. Others whispered that livestock had died after crossing her path, or that children fell ill when she passed their door. But Prudence never trembled. She never wept. She never pleaded for mercy, as so many desperate women had before her. Instead, she stood tall in her dark gown, hands clasped before her, and fixed her gaze upon those who dared accuse her. That gaze was enough. Witness after witness faltered beneath her silence. Their words stumbled. Their confidence crumbled. The fire of their accusations withered into ash as they struggled to meet her eyes. And so, the magistrates, bound by law and lacking proof, had no choice but to set her free. Each time she walked out of that courthouse, she left behind a silence that was more terrifying than any guilty verdict. For if she was not a witch, then what power did she wield that could silence the very tongues of her accusers? The legend grew. Whispers spread from tavern to church pew, from one settlement to the next. They said that Prudence Fairweather was no mere woman, that even the devil himself bowed before her. Mothers clutched their children closer when her name was spoken. Farmers crossed themselves when her figure passed along the edge of their fields. And yet, nothing could ever bind her. No rope, no accusation, no law. She remained untouchable, both feared and strangely revered. But with every accusation, with every trial survived, the weight of suspicion grew heavier. Colonial America was a land where fear was often stronger than justice, where belief in the unseen shaped the lives of all who lived there. And as Prudence's reputation swelled into something monstrous, one question remained: was she truly innocent? Or had the colonies allowed a darkness greater than any they had ever known to walk freely among them? In a time when even shadows were feared, Prudence Fairweather had become the embodiment of terror itself. A woman who defied death not through mercy, but through the sheer power of her presence. And the frontier, already haunted by hunger, war, and isolation, now carried yet another burden, the legend of a woman who was said to be untouchable, unstoppable, and perhaps unholy. This was not merely the echo of Salem. This was something new, something darker, something that would linger far beyond the trials, living on in whispers, in fireside tales, and in the deepest fears of every colonist who dared wonder what walked among them in the dark. This was the era of Prudence Fairweather, and her story was only just beginning. The year was turning into a new century, and the frontier was beginning to transform. Towns that had once been little more than muddy crossroads were now growing into permanent settlements, filled with brick storefronts, cobblestone streets, and newly laid railroads that tied the wilderness to the world beyond. Civilization was creeping westward, yet beneath this fragile veneer of order, something darker stalked the land. Everywhere Prudence Fairweather went, death followed. Not the ordinary deaths that plagued the colonies, disease, hunger, or misfortune, but something far more deliberate. The pattern was undeniable, though few dared to name it aloud. In farmhouses, in boarding rooms, in remote cabins where the wind rattled against the shutters, bodies were found. They were not merely dead, they were studied. The victims were always the same: young women who worked alone in kitchens, children tending sheep far from the watchful eyes of their families, men without kin who lived on the fringes of the settlement. They were people whose absences were not noticed until the silence grew unbearable, and when they were found, the sight was enough to shatter even the bravest soul. Their bodies bore marks unlike anything the frontier had ever known. Not the frenzied gashes of a wild beast, not the hurried wounds of a desperate killer. These were incisions, clean, deliberate, careful, as though the murderer had taken their time. Cuts mapped across the body like diagrams drawn in flesh. Whispers began to spread, passing from village to village, carried by traders, ministers, and fearful mothers. Some said Prudence Fairweather was not killing out of hatred or madness, but out of curiosity. That she was learning. Long before physicians dared to cut into the human body, long before dissection became a science, Prudence carved her lessons into the living. The idea was monstrous. In a time when death was considered sacred, when the body was to be laid to rest whole and untouched, Prudence's killings felt like a blasphemy against God himself. The preacher in one settlement declared that she was possessed by demons, a vessel of Satan sent to torment the faithful. Another claimed she was no woman at all, but a witch wearing human skin. But there were others, quiet, fearful men of reason, who saw something different. They noticed the precision of her work, the steady hand, the cold logic. To them, Prudence's crimes resembled not a demonic frenzy, but the beginnings of something terrifyingly modern. The study of anatomy, the hunger to uncover the hidden workings of the body. By the dawn of the century, her pattern was clear. Settlements began to take precautions. Doors were barred at night. Lanterns burned until dawn. Mothers taught their children never to wander alone. Yet still, Prudence moved like a shadow between them, vanishing into forests, crossing rivers under moonlight, riding in wagons among strangers who never knew they carried death in their midst. And no settlement ever forgot her passing. The silence she left behind was heavier than grief. It was dread. Because those who buried her victims knew she would strike again, somewhere just beyond the horizon. And the pattern was only growing clearer. For the first time in colonial history, fear was no longer of wolves, of hunger, or of the natives defending their homelands. Fear now had a face, and it belonged to Prudence Fairweather. Season 6 marks the point where the frontier itself begins to take notice. Her killings are no longer scattered accidents. They are a chain, a map of death that spreads westward alongside the settlers. And in those remote cabins and lonely trails, one chilling truth begins to settle into the hearts of all who hear her name. Prudence Fairweather was not just a killer. She was a student, and humanity itself was her classroom. The frontier. It was the edge of the known world, a vast and untamed wilderness stretching beyond the colonies into lands thick with forests, rivers, and silence. To many, it was a place of hope, a land of opportunity where families could carve out a future free from the grip of crowded towns and failing farms. But for others, it was a place of fear, where shadows moved between the trees and whispers carried on the wind. And wherever the settlers went, one figure seemed to follow, a woman whose name was spoken only in hushed tones. Prudence Fairweather.A.'s families packed their wagons and pushed westward into new territories. Prudence traveled among them, sometimes as a hired hand, other times as a midwife, and often simply as a drifting presence. She was the kind of woman who blended in, appearing helpful, humble, almost ordinary. But history would remember her not as a neighbor or caretaker, but as a harbinger of ruin. Cabins that once stood bright with firelight were found silent, abandoned, their doors hanging open as if the families within had simply vanished. At times, travelers discovered blackened ruins, the charred remains of homes reduced to ash, the faint outline of human forms burned into the floorboards. Some spoke of children who disappeared without a trace, their footprints ending in the woods, where no search party dared to go. Whispers spread like wildfire among the settlers. Wherever Prudence lingered, death seemed to follow. Some claimed she carried curses with her, that she poisoned wells or whispered dark words into the ears of sleeping children. Others swore she was not a woman at all, but a wandering spirit of the wilderness, an omen of death that wore a human face. What unsettled many was her uncanny ability to appear just when tragedy struck. A family would take her in, believing they had gained a helpful hand, and within weeks their fortunes would collapse. Illness would spread through the children, livestock would vanish, or fires would consume everything they owned. Prudence would be gone before the ashes cooled, drifting down another dirt road, seeking out her next unwitting hosts. The frontier was already a place of hardship. Families lived under constant threat of starvation, raids, and the merciless elements. But when Prudence's shadow touched a settlement, it was as though nature itself turned against them. Wolves grew bolder, storms struck harder, and silence hung over the woods like a warning. Over time, the stories of Prudence Fairweather grew darker, more grotesque. Men swore they had seen her in the dead of night, standing at the edge of the tree line, her eyes glinting with an unnatural light. Women told of her touch, cold as ice, when she delivered their children, children who would not live past the first season. And children whispered of lullabies she sang, words that no one else understood, words that left them trembling with nightmares they could never forget. The westward frontier promised new beginnings, but for those who crossed paths with Prudence, it delivered only despair. Her legend spread faster than the colonies themselves, carried by word of mouth along wagon trails, trading posts, and campfires. She became less a person and more a myth, an unshakable presence of dread. Prudence Fairweather was no longer just a woman of the colonies. She was the shadow of expansion, the specter that haunted the edges of civilization. And as the frontier stretched ever further, so too did the killings, spreading like a plague across the wilderness. Her name became a curse, a story told to frighten children, and yet, for those who believed they had seen her, the horror was all too real. To them, Prudence was not a tale. She was the nightmare that walked beside them, waiting for the right moment to strike, and the farther west the frontier pushed, the deeper her legend sank into the soil, leaving behind a trail of death that could not be forgotten. This was not just the story of expansion. It was the story of a woman, or perhaps something far older, who thrived on the edge of survival. A phantom of the wilderness. A predator in plain sight. The settlers believed they were carving out a new world, but in truth, they were entering hers. The frontier expanded. The killing spread. And the legend of Prudence Fairweather grew stronger with every mile. The story begins on the American frontier, a place where wilderness and civilization clashed, and where survival was never guaranteed. The land itself was unforgiving, dense forests, endless plains, and the haunting silence of nights broken only by the howl of wolves or the crack of distant gunfire. In such a place, fear was never far. But what haunted the settlers most was not hunger, nor the threat of raids, nor even the merciless winters. It was something darker, something whispered of in secret. Her name was Prudence Fairweather. By she was remembered as a woman of stern piety, carrying herself with the air of a matron. Her words dripped with scripture, her voice calm and reassuring, her presence almost maternal to those who sought her comfort. She offered weary travelers bread and shelter. She sat beside grieving widows, whispering prayers in the low light of flickering candles. She visited the churches, where her hymns were said to carry such conviction that the devout wept. But when the sun fell and shadows swallowed the frontier, Prudence became something else entirely. In taverns and in the pews of those wooden chapels, she was named the Hunter of Souls. Not a bandit, not a witch, not even a demon, though some claimed she was all three, but a predator who seemed to stalk the very essence of life itself. Her killings were not for survival, not for revenge, not even for necessity. They were for pleasure. Survivors, those rare few who slipped from her grasp, spoke of her methods. They said Prudence lured her victims with a voice as soft as silk, wrapping them in a cocoon of trust. A weary farmer, traveling alone. A child, lost in the woods. A drinker too drunk to find his way back to camp. She offered them warmth. She offered them faith. She offered them the illusion of safety. And then, with merciless precision, she struck. Her killings were not quick nor random. Each one was carefully staged, like grim performances meant to terrify whoever discovered them. Victims were arranged in grotesque poses, often with symbols carved into their skin, crosses inverted, circles drawn with ash, scripture pages nailed to their chests as though mocking the very faith she claimed to embody. It was theater of horror. The settlers could not understand it. In a land where every ounce of strength was spent simply staying alive, how could a soul be so consumed by darkness that death itself became an art form? Fear spread through the frontier like wildfire. Mothers refused to let their children stray far from their sight. Taverns closed early, their candles snuffed before the midnight bell. Men carried muskets not only for wolves and raiders, but for the possibility of crossing paths with Prudence herself. And yet, she always seemed one step ahead. A ghost among the trees. A hymn on the wind. A fleeting figure in the mist. Some believed she was no longer human at all, that she had bartered her soul for powers beyond comprehension. To them, she was a vessel of evil, draining life not for need, but for some dark communion. Others claimed she was simply mad, her heart shattered by grief and warped into cruelty. But the truth, no one could be certain. Her legend grew with every telling. To the desperate and the devout, she was a test sent by God. To the fearful and the broken, she was proof that hell walked among them. And to the survivors, she was a nightmare that never ended, her voice forever echoing in their ears, that false promise of safety before the strike. The Hunter of Souls remained at large for years, her trail marked by hollowed towns and fresh graves. Some said she disappeared into the forests and was swallowed by them, becoming a phantom whose spirit still lingers, watching, waiting. Others claimed she was hunted down, her body burned, and her ashes scattered to the wind. But even now, centuries later, her story lives on, and in those forgotten corners of America's past, where history bleeds into legend, there is always a warning whispered to travelers who find themselves alone on the road. Beware the woman who offers you comfort in the night. Beware the voice that feels too kind, too motherly, too soothing. For it may be the voice of Prudence Fairweather, the Hunter of Souls. The year was 1715. The frontier, that vast and untamed edge of the New World, was a place of both promise and peril. Here, beyond the boundaries of established towns, the wilderness stretched endlessly. Towering forests swallowed the horizon, rivers cut deep veins through the land, and silence reigned, broken only by the howling of wolves and the crack of a musket shot. For settlers, this frontier was meant to be a land of hope, a place to carve out new lives, to escape old debts, to claim freedom in the wilderness. But in the shadows of this dream lurked terror, terror that had no face, no mercy, and no explanation. By 1715, entire villages whispered the same name. Mothers barred their doors at night. Children were told never to stray past the fields, and fathers kept muskets within reach even in daylight. She was not a rumor anymore. She was a reality, a curse made flesh. Some called her a phantom. Others said she was a woman who had long ago traded her soul for dominion over life and death. Ministers thundered from pulpits that she was the very embodiment of evil, that God had loosed a punishment upon the people for their sins. And still, there were others who swore she was simply human, yet her cruelty made her more monstrous than any spirit. Her name was Prudence Fairweather. Once, she had been no different from the rest, born into the hardships of colonial life, hardened by hunger, storms, and endless labor. But somewhere along the line, something inside her turned. Perhaps it was madness, perhaps it was rage, or perhaps, as many believed, it was something far darker. What the people knew for certain was this: wherever Prudence went, death followed. It began with livestock found butchered in the fields, drained of blood with no prints in the mud. Then came the children, vanishing into the trees, never to return. A search party was once sent to track her down, 30 men sworn to bring her to justice. At dawn, every one of them was found lying in the frost, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. Not a mark on their bodies, but their lives extinguished all the same. The frontier had always been dangerous: wolves, hostile raids, disease. But this was something different. This was terror that stripped communities of their courage, that made even the strongest men afraid to step outside after dark. Entire villages lived under the weight of her shadow. Families abandoned their homesteads, leaving cabins to rot in the woods. Roads grew empty, and churches echoed with desperate prayers. Ministers declared that the land itself had been cursed, that perhaps the wilderness was never meant for men to tame. The stories only grew with time. Some said Prudence could not die, that she was immortal, doomed to wander the frontier until Judgment Day. Others whispered she could command the very forest, calling the trees and rivers to hide her from pursuit. A few even claimed that they had seen her eyes in the dark, glowing like embers as she watched from the tree line. What made her most terrifying was not only her cruelty, but her silence. She spoke to no one. She offered no reason for the horror she unleashed. She came, she struck, and she vanished. In those years, communities on the edge of the wilderness lived in constant dread. Each dawn was a fragile gift, each nightfall a sentence. Families huddled close to their hearts, listening for footsteps in the snow, praying not to hear a knock at their door. For on the frontier, they knew, a knock in the night was rarely from a neighbor. The frontier of 1715 was more than a battlefield between man and wilderness. It became a stage for one of the darkest legends of early America. Prudence Fairweather was no longer just a woman. She was a specter of fear, a reminder that in the thin veil between civilization and the untamed wild, terror could take human form. And so the story spread, carried by whispers and sermons, etched into the memories of those who survived. By the end of that year, entire villages were ghost towns, their people scattered, their courage shattered. This was Season 9, Communities in Terror. A time when the frontier did not just challenge the body, but haunted the soul. Because sometimes, the greatest danger is not the wilderness around us, but the darkness within us. The American frontier was a land of contradictions. It was a place where survival demanded strength, where faith and superstition lived side by side, and where the thin line between respectability and savagery could vanish in the blink of an eye. Families carved homes out of wilderness, churches rose beside taverns, and law often lagged far behind human ambition. It was in this dangerous landscape that Prudence Fairweather thrived, cloaked in a mask of dignity that deceived nearly everyone. Prudence was cunning. She understood the fragile balance of frontier life, and she used it to her advantage. Outwardly, she was a woman of service, a healer, and a midwife. Neighbors called upon her in their darkest hours, when a fever burned hot through the night, when childbirth carried women to the brink of death, when an infant's first cry decided the fate of a family line. To the community, Prudence was indispensable. She offered herbs for pain, prayers for strength, and gentle hands to guide children into the world. But beneath the surface, a different truth writhed like a serpent in the shadows. Prudence's knowledge of herbs and remedies was not born solely from compassion. It came from darker experiments, from hours spent testing the limits of life and death. Her neighbors saw a woman of faith, but what they did not see was the cold fascination in her eyes when an infant failed to draw its first breath. Mothers whispered, quietly, when no men were near. They spoke of babies delivered by Prudence, who never lived to see the dawn. They spoke of children whose fragile bodies bore no signs of struggle, only silence. Yet Prudence's face never carried sorrow. She would bow her head, murmur a prayer, and offer comfort. She would tell families that God had taken the child back into his arms. And because she was cloaked in respectability, because she was trusted and revered, none dared to accuse her. In truth, Prudence had mastered the frontier's greatest deception, the ability to live in two worlds at once. To men, she was the wise healer who calmed their wives' labors with herbs and whispered blessings. To women, she was both savior and executioner, guiding them through the perils of childbirth while secretly deciding which lives were worth sparing. Her dual existence made her untouchable. Who would dare accuse the woman who had once saved their child, their wife, their very life? Her mask of piety was her greatest weapon. On Sundays, she knelt at the front of the church, her hands folded in prayer, her voice steady in hymn. She knew every scripture, every verse, and she spoke them with conviction. To the congregation, she was a pillar of righteousness. To herself, she was a predator hidden in plain sight. The mask of respectability gave her freedom to commit acts that would have seen any other woman dragged into the streets and punished. As the frontier grew, Prudence's legend grew with it. Some saw her as a blessing, others as a curse. But all agreed on one truth: she was necessary. In a world where doctors were scarce and death was a constant companion, Prudence filled a void no one else could. And that need made her untouchable, even as fear spread through the whispers of grieving mothers. The mask of respectability was not just Prudence's disguise, it was her masterpiece. It allowed her to weave herself into the very fabric of her community while hiding the rot that consumed her soul. And as the years passed, she became not just a woman of the frontier, but a legend of it, one that blurred the line between healer and killer, saint and sinner. This is the story of Season 10, The Mask of Respectability, where survival, fear, and deception were not just the conditions of the frontier, but the very tools of Prudence Fairweather's reign of terror. The year was drawing toward the close of the 17th century, and the colonies no longer looked like the fragile settlements of decades before. The frontier still stretched vast and untamed, but now forts, trading posts, and villages dotted the wilderness. Lawmen were appointed, militias drilled, and watchtowers rose like sentinels against the dark unknown. Yet in the shadows of this growing order, the name Prudence Fairweather lingered like a ghost, whispered in dread from one cabin to the next. Prudence was no longer young. Her hair, once dark, had turned a ghostly white, and her face was a mask of deep lines carved by both age and savagery. Yet far from softening, she had grown sharper, crueler, more deliberate in her violence. Where others her age clutched grandchildren on their knees, Prudence walked the wilderness like a phantom wolf, her knife always glinting in the firelight of another ruined home. Entire families began to vanish from their cabins. A father, a mother, 3 children, the hearth left cold, the livestock wandering untended. At first neighbors thought them victims of raids or the hardships of frontier life. But when shallow graves were uncovered in the woods, the truth revealed itself with a sickening finality. Each body bore the same mark, meticulous cuts, deliberate incisions, a grotesque signature only one hand could leave. Prudence had returned to her craft, and she was no longer satisfied with lone wanderers or careless travelers. Now, she took whole households, erasing their names from memory, as if she alone decided who deserved to endure. The colonies stirred with outrage. This was no longer a matter of rumor or hushed warnings by firelight. This was an epidemic of terror. Notices were nailed to trees and tavern doors, proclamations from governors themselves. A bounty was declared on Prudence Fairweather, the largest ever set in colonial memory. Militia companies swore oaths to hunt her, scouts pledged to track her through the wilderness, and men who had once dismissed tales of a murderous woman now admitted, with pale faces, that she was real. But Prudence knew the land better than any hunter sent after her. She moved like a shadow across the frontier, always one step ahead. Where the rivers bent, she crossed unseen. Where the pine thickets closed, she vanished like smoke. She had walked these woods since childhood, and every hidden path, every deer trail, every stream bed was hers. Men who chased her found only the remains of their comrades, throats cut clean, muskets left bloodied in the dirt. And yet, something in Prudence had shifted. No longer did she kill with the quiet patience of her earlier years. Now there was a frenzy to her work, a hunger unchained. She slaughtered with spectacle, leaving scenes so grotesque that even hardened soldiers retched. The frontier itself seemed to recoil at her presence, as if the land was weary of the evil it sheltered. Still, she endured. Winter passed into spring, and the hunt dragged on. Villages prayed for deliverance. Children were warned never to stray beyond the sound of the church bell. And in every prayer circle, one question remained unanswered. How could a single woman, aged and worn, outwit the growing might of the colonies? The answer lay in fear itself. Prudence had become more than flesh and blood. She was a legend, a curse whispered in the stillness of the woods. For those who hunted her, the mere crack of a twig was enough to scatter their courage. The thought of her pale hair drifting through the trees, the gleam of her knife in the moonlight, these were enough to turn seasoned trackers into trembling men. And so her atrocities continued, even as the colonies closed in. The final chapter of Prudence Fairweather's reign of terror was no longer written in secrecy, but in open defiance of the world that tried to contain her. She was, to the bitter end, the frontier's darkest phantom, a woman who should have faded into the quiet of old age, but instead chose to carve her name into history with blood. This was the twilight of her terror, the last brutal season of killings that echoed through colonial memory. A season that left behind not just graves in the soil, but a legacy of fear that would never die. The colonies were young, fragile, and carved out of wilderness that seemed endless. To the settlers, The frontier was both promise and peril, a vast expanse of forests, rivers, and mountains stretching into mystery. It offered freedom, fertile land, and opportunity. But it also whispered of danger, shadows, and the unknown. And it was within this dangerous, shifting world that the legend of Prudence Fairweather came to its haunting close. For years, she had stalked the settlements, leaving behind a trail of terror. Entire households were whispered to have fallen by her hand. And yet, with every tale, her figure grew larger than life. She was not merely a woman anymore, but a symbol of everything the frontier could unleash: chaos, madness, lawlessness. And then, one day, she was gone. There were no trials, no bodies, no hanging tree to mark her end. Just silence. Some swore she perished in the wilds, perhaps caught by wolves, or consumed by the very wilderness that had long hidden her. Others whispered she fled across the Atlantic, vanishing into the smoke-filled streets of Europe, where no one knew her name. A darker story spread along the coastal taverns, that she had thrown her lot in with pirates, sailing under false colors, her great hair hidden beneath a scarf, her blade as quick as ever. But the tale most often told, the one mothers used to hush restless children, was that Prudence never left at all. They said she simply slipped into the crowds of newcomers. Her hair had grown long and silver, her face lined with age, but her eyes, they said her eyes, still carried that same cold fire. She could be anyone. The quiet old widow in the market, the stern matron at church, the silent stranger passing through town. On the frontier, where law was thin and neighbors were strangers, fear did not fade easily. Her name became a legend, an omen, a curse whispered around hearth fires. Parents leaned close to their children and warned, "Behave, or Prudence will find you." And so the wilderness and the woman became one in memory. Just as the frontier itself devoured those who wandered too far, Prudence Fairweather became the embodiment of vanishing. She disappeared not into the grave, nor into the sea, but into story itself. Yet every legend carries its purpose. Her tale was a warning that even as the colonies grew, the wilderness remained untamed, that civilization was fragile, and that sometimes the true danger was not the beasts in the woods, nor the enemies across borders, but the faces we thought we knew. Season 12 closes not with resolution, but with disappearance. No justice, no final resting place, only the echo of footsteps fading into the forest. And perhaps, just perhaps, if you listen closely on a dark night, with the wind howling through the trees, you may still hear her name whispered across the frontier: Prudence Fairweather, the woman who vanished, the legend that never died. The American frontier was never merely a place on a map. It was a state of mind, a vast and untamed wilderness that tested the souls of all who dared to step beyond the safety of the coastal settlements. The forests loomed like cathedral walls of pine and oak. Rivers ran wild, carving valleys that whispered with fog and superstition. And every shadow carried the weight of the unknown. It was into this crucible of hardship and hope that settlers ventured, chasing promises of land, freedom, and fortune. But the frontier was not kind. Disease, starvation, and brutal winters claimed countless lives. The threat of conflict, both with the wilderness itself and with other men, hung like a storm over every cabin and clearing. In such a place, legends were born. Some were tales of courage, resilience, and survival. Others were darker, stories where fear took root in the hearts of men and grew into nightmares. Among these stories, none is as haunting, as whispered, or as enduring as the tale of Prudence Fairweather. To some, she was a woman twisted by the merciless reality of colonial life. To others, she was a creature apart, a predator wrapped in human skin. The truth is shrouded in the mists of time. But what remains is a legacy written in fear, in blood, and in the whispered warnings passed from generation to generation. Prudence Fairweather was born at the edge of the known world. The date is uncertain, the records faded, but what is known is that her childhood was carved from suffering. Her family, like many, sought prosperity in the colonies, only to be met with loss. Death struck early and often, siblings lost to fever, neighbors gone to raids, her own mother buried beneath the frost of a merciless winter. These were not uncommon tragedies in the colonies. Yet for Prudence, something inside her changed. Where others bent beneath sorrow, she hardened. Where others wept, she grew silent. And in that silence, something dark began to take shape. The wilderness became her companion. While other children played near the safety of the settlement, Prudence wandered deeper into the woods. She learned its paths, its silences, and its secrets. Neighbors would later whisper that she spoke to the trees, that she lingered by the graves of the dead, that she watched with cold, unblinking eyes. But these were only whispers. No one could have imagined the shadow she would one day cast across the frontier. As Prudence grew, death followed her like a shadow. At first, it was livestock found slaughtered in grotesque ways, their bodies arranged as though by unseen hands. Then, it was neighbors who vanished without explanation, their cabins left quiet, their hearts cold. Rumors began to spread, carried in hushed tones around flickering candlelight. They said Prudence could slip through the woods without sound, that animals stilled at her presence, that misfortune seemed to bloom wherever she walked. But superstition was as much a part of colonial life as hunger and frost. And so the settlers turned their suspicions inward, blaming spirits, curses, or the wilderness itself. Prudence, pale and withdrawn, was overlooked, dismissed as a strange but harmless woman. That illusion shattered when bodies began to be found. The killings were unlike anything the frontier had ever seen. Victims were not merely murdered, they were displayed, as if their deaths carried a message. Men were found with their tools beside them, women with their hands clasped as if in false prayer, children laid out in patterns that no one could understand. Fear gripped the settlement. Doors were bolted at sundown. Families huddled together in silence, praying for dawn. Whispers grew louder now. Some claimed she was possessed, others that she had made a pact with forces that dwelled in the forest's endless dark. But by the time suspicion finally settled on her, it was too late. Prudence Fairweather had become something more than a woman. She was a legend of terror, a name spoken in dread, a symbol of the darkness that lurked in the wilderness. What became of her remains uncertain. Some say she was hunted down and burned, her screams rising with the smoke into the night sky. Others say she fled into the forests, where she still walks, her spirit forever bound to the land that birthed her darkness. And there are those who believe she never died at all, that she simply vanished, waiting, watching, her story written not in ink, but in the shiver that runs down the spine of anyone who speaks her name. Even centuries later, the tale of Prudence Fairweather endures. For the settlers, she became a cautionary tale, a reminder that the wilderness was not only a place of opportunity, but also of danger. For historians, she remains a mystery. Was she truly a killer, or merely a victim of rumor and fear magnified by superstition? We may never know. But the legacy of fear she left behind is undeniable. Her story reminds us that the frontier was more than a struggle against the land. It was a struggle against the darkness within ourselves. And in that darkness, Prudence Fairweather carved her place as colonial America's most feared serial killer. The wilderness of the frontier was vast, but so too was the reach of fear. And in the end, it was not the snow, the hunger, or the wild beasts that haunted the settlers most. It was the thought that somewhere in the endless woods, in the silence between the trees, Prudence Fairweather was waiting.